Welcome, Night Owl. I'm delighted you've joined me tonight for these soothing yet enlightening stories from the past, designed to help you unwind and drift into slumber as we explore the lives of history's most infamous and tyrannical medieval kings. Before we begin, feel free to share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. If you enjoy this style of calm historical storytelling, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss future episodes. Tonight, we'll delve into the reigns of some of the most notorious monarchs of the Middle Ages, kings whose rules were overshadowed by cruelty, instability, or downright bizarre behavior. Through their tales, we'll uncover the complexities of power, the toll of mental illness, and the indelible marks these rulers left on their kingdoms and the world. So, get comfortable, settle in, and let me transport you back to the grand courts and shadowy castles of medieval Europe. Our first stop is 14th century France, where we meet a king whose reign began with boundless promise but spiraled into chaos as madness consumed his mind. Charles VI of France was just 11 years old when he ascended the throne in 1380. In his early years, he was a beacon of hope, adored by his subjects who affectionately called him Charles the Beloved. Youthful, energetic, and brimming with chivalric charm, he hosted lavish festivities that made the future of France seem brighter than ever. But everything changed on a fateful winter night in 1393, when a single reckless moment altered the course of his life and his kingdom forever. During a masquerade ball at the royal palace, Charles and a group of nobles dressed as wild men, their costumes made of linen soaked in flammable resin and adorned with flax to mimic the appearance of savages. As the dancing began, disaster struck. The king's brother, Louis, Duke of Orleans, brought a torch too close to the dancers. The costumes ignited instantly, engulfing the men in flames. The hall erupted into chaos, filled with screams and panic. The Duchess of Berry threw her robe over Charles, saving his life, but four noblemen perished in agony days later from their burns. Though Charles escaped physical harm, the psychological scars ran deep. The event, later dubbed the Bal d'Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men, left him shattered. In the months that followed, whispers spread through the court. The king had lost his mind to shock. His behavior grew increasingly erratic and disturbing. He would sprint through palace corridors, howling like a wolf, convinced he was made of glass and might shatter at any moment. At times, he forgot his own name and title, failing to recognize his wife or children. Once, he became so convinced he was St. George that he ordered the royal arms to be changed accordingly. For months, he refused to bathe, change clothes, or cut his hair and nails. Courtiers watched with a mix of pity and disgust as he wandered the palace in tattered, vermin-infested robes, his hair matted and filthy. In rare moments of clarity, Charles was gentle and melancholic, deeply distressed by his own condition. But these lucid intervals grew fewer as his illness progressed. As Charles descended further into madness, France crumbled around him. Rival factions seized the opportunity to advance their agendas, maneuvering to control the crown. The king's incapacity created a power vacuum, destabilizing the entire kingdom. His reign, once so full of promise, became a tragic saga of turmoil at home and abroad. Ambitious nobles and relatives vied for influence, their infighting fracturing the nation. Meanwhile, England exploited France's weakness, reigniting the Hundred Years' War to press its claim to the French throne. Through it all, Charles drifted in and out of awareness, a king in title but not in ability. When coherent, he tried to fulfill his duties and restore stability to his fractured realm. But these efforts were fleeting. More often, he spent his days in a pitiful state, unable to rule or even comprehend his own decline. There were poignant glimpses of the man he once was. During a brief respite from his illness, Charles encountered an old friend, a knight he hadn't seen in years. Surprised to find him at court, the king asked why he had come. With tears in his eyes, the knight replied, "To see you, my king, for it has been long since I last did." Charles embraced him warmly and wept, saying, "Good sir, You are indeed one of my loyal knights and friends. Stay with me, for you are most welcome." For that fleeting moment, the king emerged from the depths of his madness, lucid and deeply moved by this display of loyalty. But such moments were rare. As the years passed, Charles grew more withdrawn, lost in the labyrinth of his crumbling mind. By the end of his life, he was a hollow shell of the vibrant young man who had once been the hope of France. When he finally succumbed to dysentery in 1422, his son, Charles VII, had already begun ruling in his stead. The reign of Charles VI, which began with such promise, ended in sorrow and disarray. The king, once beloved by his people, spent his final years as a broken figure, pitiable one moment, terrifying the next, as his delusions gripped him. His tragic fate serves as a stark reminder of how a nation's fortunes could hinge on the stability of its ruler's mind in an era when kings wielded absolute, yet fragile, power. From one troubled monarch, we now cross the English Channel to another whose reign was similarly marred by mental illness. Like Charles, Henry VI of England was gentle, pious, and scholarly by nature. But like his French counterpart, he would buckle under the pressures of kingship, with devastating consequences for his realm. Henry's reign was fraught from the start. He inherited the throne as an infant, just 9 months old, far too young to rule. Regents governed in his name, while rival factions schemed to control the child king, hoping to dominate the kingdom through him. The early years of Henry's reign were marked by a fierce struggle for power among his ambitious relatives and advisors. Even as a young man, Henry was more drawn to religion and learning than to the arts of war and statecraft expected of a monarch. Deeply devout, he attended Mass daily and spent hours in prayer and contemplation. He was also a passionate scholar with a love for reading and education, later founding 2 of England's most prestigious institutions, Eton College and King's College, Cambridge. But while Henry's gentle nature endeared him to some, it left him ill-equipped for the cutthroat politics swirling around the throne. As he came of age and assumed his royal duties, he floundered in his attempts to mediate the squabbling factions and unify his kingdom. The greatest blow to his reign came in August 1453, when the king suddenly fell into a catatonic stupor, unable to speak, recognize anyone, or respond to stimuli. For over a year, he remained in this vegetative state, oblivious even to the birth of his own son and heir. Like his grandfather, Charles VI of France, whose temperament and fate he mirrored, Henry's mysterious illness plunged his kingdom into turmoil. With the king incapacitated, old feuds erupted into open conflict. The simmering rivalry between the houses of Lancaster and York, 2 branches of the Plantagenet dynasty, boiled over into outright war, each side vying for supremacy. This struggle would become known as the Wars of the Roses, named after the red and white rose emblems of the rival factions. Even when Henry briefly emerged from his catatonia in late 1454, he struggled to regain control of the political chaos. By 1455, the Yorkists felt bold enough to take up arms against the king's Lancastrian supporters, defeating them at the First Battle of St. Albans. Henry was captured by the Yorkists and forced to acknowledge their leader, Richard, Duke of York, as Lord Protector of the realm. In the years that followed, England descended into intermittent civil war, with the hapless Henry shuffled between the warring factions. Whenever he lapsed back into insanity, fresh fighting erupted as each side sought to control his person, and with it, the legitimacy of rule. During his bouts of madness, Henry's behavior was pitifully childlike. He had to be fed, washed, and dressed like an infant. The once keen scholar now showed no interest in his books or papers. He gave no sign of recognizing his own wife and son. To most observers, the king seemed utterly lost within himself, an empty vessel stripped of will and sense. Henry briefly regained his throne with Lancastrian support in 1470, but by this point he was merely a figurehead, a feeble puppet controlled by his ambitious queen, Margaret of Anjou, and the ruthless Earl of Warwick. Less than a year later, the Yorkists struck back, capturing Henry and forcing him to abdicate in favor of the Yorkist King Edward IV. The final, sorrowful chapter of Henry's life unfolded within the cold stone walls of the Tower of London, where he was imprisoned by Edward. There, abandoned by allies and stripped of his crown, Henry's already fragile grasp on reality disintegrated completely. When informed of his young son's death at the Battle of Tewkesbury, he reportedly showed no reaction, lost in the shattered corridors of his own mind. Just days later, on the night of May 21st, 1471, Henry himself was found lifeless in his chamber under mysterious circumstances. While the official account claimed he died of pure displeasure and melancholy, many suspected foul play, with fingers pointed squarely at the Yorkist king. And so ended the tragic life of Henry VI, a king perhaps too gentle and pious for the ruthless era into which he was born. His decades of ineffective rule, punctuated by debilitating mental breakdowns, fractured the royal dynasty and plunged England into one of its darkest chapters. Like Charles the Mad across the Channel, Henry's fate demonstrates how profoundly a monarch's mental state could alter the destiny of an entire nation. From England, we now journey north to 16th century Scandinavia to meet another ruler whose promising reign was derailed by paranoia and madness. Eric XIV of Sweden possessed all the qualities of a strong monarch, educated, cultured, and charismatic. But like Charles and Henry before him, he would succumb to mental illness with disastrous consequences for his kingdom. Eric ascended the Swedish throne in 1560 after the death of his formidable father, Gustav I. He inherited a well-centralized state and initially proved himself a capable ruler, a patron of arts and sciences, an accomplished scholar, poet, and composer. Yet even amid the splendor of his coronation festivities, there were hints of the erratic behavior that would later consume him. As his reign progressed, Eric grew increasingly suspicious and paranoid. He saw threats everywhere, convinced that Swedish nobles and the aristocracies of neighboring Denmark and Poland were plotting to overthrow him. These fears were stoked by his chief advisor, Göran Persson, who exploited the king's fragile mental state to eliminate political rivals. Eric's personal life proved equally tumultuous. Early in his reign, he fell passionately in love with Karen Mansdottir, a beautiful commoner who had served as a maid in the royal household. Defying all convention and the protests of his advisors, Eric secretly married Karen in 1567 and had her crowned queen. While scandalous, the marriage provided rare stability, with Karen remaining loyal even during Eric's darkest days. The defining moment of Eric's reign came in 1567 with the infamous Stuart murders. Convinced the powerful Stuart noble family was conspiring against him, Eric had several members imprisoned on fabricated charges. In a fit of paranoid rage, the king personally stabbed and killed one noble, Nils Stuart, during an interrogation. Two other Stuart lords and their associates were subsequently executed on Eric's orders. The murders shocked Sweden and turned public sentiment against the increasingly unstable king. Eric's behavior grew more erratic. He became obsessed with astrology and the occult, convinced he could divine the future in the stars. Wild manic episodes alternated with deep melancholy. At times he declared himself a god, demanding courtiers worship him. As opposition mounted, Eric's own brothers, John and Charles, moved against him. In 1568, they successfully deposed Eric, forcing his abdication in favor of John III. The coup was supported by most Swedish nobles, alienated by the king's tyranny and madness. Eric's final years were marked by tragedy and mental deterioration. Imprisoned in various castles by his brother, the deposed king descended deeper into insanity. He became convinced he wasn't Eric XIV at all, but another man entirely. Only his devoted wife Karen could soothe his agitated states during their shared captivity. In 1577, after nearly a decade imprisoned, the 43-year-old Eric died, likely poisoned on his brother's orders, and was buried hastily, without ceremony. For John III, his mad brother represented an uncomfortable reminder of royal power's fragility and the ever-present danger of succession crises. Eric Xiv's story is one of wasted potential. A gifted, cultured man who showed such promise as a ruler but proved unequal to kingship's immense stresses. His unraveling mind led him down a path of tyranny that undid his achievements and fractured his kingdom. Traveling further east to Russia, we encounter another ruler undone by paranoia and mental illness. Ivan IV Vasilyevic, better known as Ivan the Terrible, the first Grand Prince of Moscow to officially assume the title of Tsar of all Russia. His nearly 40-year reign would transform Russia but also unleash a whirlwind of brutality upon his realm. Ivan's early life was scarred by tragedy and insecurity. Orphaned by age 8, he grew up amidst power struggles between ambitious nobles who controlled the regency. The young Ivan learned to fear for his life, seeing conspiracies everywhere, experiences that laid the groundwork for his later paranoia and ruthlessness. When Ivan assumed full power in 1547, he quickly consolidated control over the fractious nobility. Talented and energetic, he achieved military victories against Russia's enemies, expanded its borders, and implemented popular reforms like revising the legal code and convening Russia's first parliament. These successes marked his early reign with relative stability and progress. But as years passed, Ivan grew increasingly erratic, suspicious, and violent. Convinced the boyars, nobles, were plotting against him, his resentment boiled over in 1565 when he suddenly left Moscow in a rage, threatening to abdicate. In a calculated power play, he agreed to return only if granted absolute authority to punish traitors as he saw fit. The cowed boyars acquiesced. Upon his return, Ivan unleashed terror against the nobility, confiscating lands, executing or exiling those he distrusted. To enforce his will, he created the Oprichnina, a brutal secret police force fanatically loyal to him alone. In subsequent years, Ivan earned his epithet, the Terrible, through a reign of terror fueled by paranoia and sadism. Cruel punishments became commonplace: torture, public executions, mass killings. Entire noble families were destroyed, towns razed. Even the city of Novgorod was sacked to root out alleged conspiracies. The later years of Ivan's reign saw personal tragedy compound his madness. In 1581, during an argument, he struck his pregnant daughter-in-law, causing a miscarriage. When his eldest son and heir, Ivan Ivanovich, confronted him, the Tsar, in uncontrolled rage, struck his son's head with an iron-tipped staff, dealing a fatal blow. Mad with grief and remorse, Ivan descended into incoherent rampages, alternately praying feverishly for forgiveness and ordering fresh executions. His son's death represented both personal and dynastic catastrophe, as his remaining heirs were unfit to rule. As we delve deeper into medieval monarchs plagued by madness, we turn eastward to Russia's vast expanse and its most infamous ruler, Ivan IV, whose legacy is as complex as it is brutal. Born in 1530, Ivan's early life was marked by turmoil. His father died when he was 3, leaving his mother Elena Glinskaya as regent until her suspected poisoning 5 years later. The boy who would become the Terrible was left to navigate a snake pit of scheming boyars who neglected and abused him. Courtiers reportedly mocked and terrorized young Ivan and his deaf-mute brother Yuri, sometimes leaving them hungry. These experiences bred deep mistrust and resentment that would later explode into violence. Yet Ivan was also precocious. By 16, he was already asserting authority. In one brutal early display, he ordered the arrest of Andrei Shuaysky, head of the boyars. Shuaysky was dragged from the palace, beaten, and thrown to starving dogs. A gruesome preview of the brutality that would define Ivan's rule. But Ivan's early years weren't all darkness. In 1547, the 16-year-old was crowned Tsar of all Russia in a magnificent ceremony that firmly established his authority. That same year, he married his first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, whom he genuinely loved. For a time, Ivan's reign seemed destined for greatness. His early rule saw remarkable achievements: legal reforms limiting boyar power, establishment of local self-government, and military victories against the Kazan and Astrakhan Khanates that expanded Russia's borders to the Caspian Sea. These triumphs earned Ivan widespread acclaim as a conquering czar who brought glory to Russia. Yet darker currents swirled beneath the surface. The traumas of Ivan's childhood left deep scars. In 1553, a near-fatal illness triggered paranoia when boyars scrambled for power, anticipating his death. This was compounded in 1560 when his beloved Anastasia died suddenly. Ivan became convinced she'd been poisoned by his enemies, particularly the boyars he already distrusted. In grief and paranoia, Ivan's rule turned dark. Boyars were arrested, tortured, and executed on flimsy pretexts. His wrath extended to entire cities. In 1570, suspecting Novgorod of treason, Ivan ordered a massacre that left thousands dead, their blood reportedly turning the Fokhov River red. The Oprichniki, Ivan's black-clad secret police, became symbols of his terror. They answered only to the Tsar, carrying out executions and purges with ruthless efficiency. Even the church wasn't spared. Metropolitan Philip II of Moscow was arrested and killed for criticizing Oprichniki excesses. As Ivan's paranoia spiraled, Russia unraveled. The economy faltered as peasants fled Oprichniki brutality, leaving fields untended. Famine and disease spread. But the darkest moment came in 1581 when Ivan, during an argument, fatally struck his heir Ivan Ivanovich with a pointed staff. The Tsar's subsequent grief was horrifying to behold. He cradled his dying son, wailing for forgiveness, but the damage was done. This personal tragedy seemed to break something in Ivan. His final years were spent in isolation, racked by guilt, alternating between prayer and renewed violence until his death in 1584 during a chess game. Legend says just as he moved his king into checkmate, as if acknowledging his own demise. Ivan's legacy is profoundly contradictory. A man capable of great piety and cruelty, who expanded Russia's borders while traumatizing its people. He remains a towering, terrifying figure whose life serves as a cautionary tale about absolute power's corrupting influence. As we reflect on these tragic tales of medieval monarchs undone by madness, a disturbing pattern emerges. The immense pressures of kingship, the constant threats, the weight of absolute power, the isolation at the top, could warp even the strongest minds. In an age when rulers were seen as God's representatives on earth, the line between monarch and mortal was perilously thin. Consider Rudolph II, Holy Roman Emperor from 1576 to 1612. A great patron of arts and sciences, Rudolph filled his Prague castle with astronomers, alchemists, and curiosities like the legendary golem. But beneath this Renaissance facade lurked deeper troubles. Plagued by depression and paranoia, Rudolph became increasingly reclusive, sometimes refusing to leave his bed for days, communicating with advisors only through notes slipped under his door. His most famous delusion? The unshakable belief that he was made of glass, so fragile he might shatter at any moment. He took to wearing thick padded clothing and forbade anyone from touching him. As government ground to a halt, his own family conspired to depose him in favor of his brother Matthias. Rudolph spent his final years surrounded by his art collections, but utterly isolated from the empire he once ruled, refusing last rites as his delusions persisted to the end. The Byzantine Empire had its own mad emperor in Justin II, 565 to 578 AD. Initially promising, his behavior soon turned bizarre. He became convinced he couldn't sit, so he moved about lying prone on a wheeled throne. He reportedly bid attendants and even attempted to eat one of his own lambs. As Justin descended into madness, enemies closed in on the empire. Persians attacked from the east, Avars and Slavs from the west, while Italy fell to Lombard invaders. Only his shrewd wife Sophia's regency prevented complete collapse. Perhaps the most pitiful case was Charles II of Spain, 1661 to 1700. the last Habsburg ruler whose physical and mental deformities resulted from generations of inbreeding. His grotesquely enlarged tongue made speech difficult, his jaw jutted so severely he couldn't chew properly, and his mind never progressed beyond childhood. Yet contemporaries described him as gentle and kind, taking simple joy in his collection of pocket watches. When this bewitched king died childless, his passing triggered the War of Spanish Succession, proof that even the most powerless monarch struggles could reshape continents. These stories reveal the devastating impact a ruler's mental state could have in an era of absolute monarchy. Without modern understanding of mental illness, erratic behavior was often interpreted as divine punishment or demonic possession. Court physicians prescribed useless remedies while rivals exploited royal instability to seize power. The medieval world expected kings to be warrior philosophers, wise yet fierce, pious yet ruthless. When rulers like Charles VI of France exhibited weakness through mental illness, it wasn't just a personal tragedy, but a national crisis. The very fabric of society seemed to unravel when God's anointed behaved like anything less than perfect sovereigns. Yet within these dark tales glimmer moments of profound humanity. Ivan the Terrible weeping over his son's corpse. Eric XIV finding solace in his commoner wife, Karen's loyalty. Charles II subjects loving their poor fool king despite his inadequacies. These remind us that behind every crown beat a human heart, fragile, flawed, and achingly vulnerable. As sleep beckons, let these stories serve as reminders. Power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. And in its harsh light, we see that greatness and madness often share the same shadowy borders. The pressures that broke these kings, isolation, suspicion, unbearable expectations, still haunt leaders today, albeit in different forms. Perhaps the true lesson lies not in judging these long-dead monarchs, but in recognizing the universal fragility of the human mind when burdened with impossible responsibility. Their tragedies echo through time not because they were monsters, but because they were men who cracked under the weight of crowns they never asked to bear. So as you drift toward dreams, spare a thought for these tormented souls. The boy king Henry VI, who loved books more than battle. The creative Eric XIV composing poetry even as paranoia consumed him. Ivan the Terrible, who built St. Basil's Cathedral's colorful domes even as he drowned Russia in blood. Their stories are more than historical curiosities. They're cautionary tales about the price of power and the delicate architecture of the human psyche. And with that, dear listener, I leave you to your rest. May your sleep be untroubled by visions of burning balls, glass emperors, or iron-tipped scepters. For unlike these tragic kings, you can lay down your burdens, real and imagined, until morning light. The cruelest irony of these mad monarchs' reigns was how their personal demons became their kingdom's catastrophes. When kings like Charles VI forgot their own names, entire nations slipped into amnesia, laws unenforced, borders undefended, the very idea of order dissolving like parchment in rain. The medieval world had no safety nets for mental collapse. A king's fractured mind meant a fractured realm. Take England's Henry VI. His decades of catatonia created a vacuum that turned noble rivalries into the bloody wars of the Roses. During his sleeping sickness, the kingdom became a chessboard where York and Lancaster pieces slaughtered each other while the king nominal lay motionless. Unaware, he'd become a pawn in his own story. Even his brief awakenings brought no relief, like a sleeper stirring mid-nightmare only to find reality worse. The Swedish court under Eric XIV turned equally surreal. Imagine the terror of advisors watching their king, once an erudite patron of astronomers, suddenly declare himself a god while ordering executions based on star charts. His downfall came not from foreign armies, but his own brother's revolt, proving madness could topple kings faster than any rebellion. The final indignity? Being upstaged in history by his victim Niels Stewar's widow, the legendary Countess of Argyll, whose revenge plot became Scandinavian folklore. Ivan the Terrible's Russia descended into a looking-glass world where black-clad opportunity riders enforced the Tsar's whims with methods straight from hell's bureaucracy. The same hands that built St. Basil's rainbow domes signed death warrants for entire towns. His infamous library of occult texts, said to include the actual Necronomicon, disappeared after his death, leaving historians wondering, did black magic fuel his tyranny, or was the real demon the trauma of his boyar-tortured childhood? Even the architecture reflected these rulers' unraveling minds. Rudolf II's Prague castle became a claustrophobic cabinet of curiosities where the emperor wandered among astrolabes and deformed animal specimens, talking to portraits. Charles II El Escorial Palace stood half empty, its vast halls echoing with the clatter of the dwarves he employed as living toys. These weren't just residences, but physical manifestations of crumbling psyches. Yet for all their notoriety, these monarchs were also products of their time's limited medical understanding. What we now recognize as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or PTSD were then humors out of balance, or demonic possession. Treatments ranged from useless, herbal poultices, to barbaric, trepanation to release evil spirits. Small wonder their conditions worsened when court physicians' cures involved more bloodletting than counseling. The tragedy compounds when we consider their moments of clarity, those heartbreaking instances when the fog lifted. Henry VI reportedly wept upon seeing his infant son for the first time after a year-long catatonia. Ivan wrote anguished letters to monasteries begging prayers for his soul. Even Rudolph's glass delusion reveals profound self-awareness. What better metaphor for a ruler's fragility than believing yourself made of breakable transparency? Modern psychology might have saved them. Cognitive therapy for Eric's paranoia, mood stabilizers for Charles VI oscillations between mania and depression, trauma counseling for Ivan. Instead, they were left to drown in minds that became their own torture chambers, taking thousands down with them. As you drift off tonight, consider this. We judge these kings harshly because their power amplified their damage. But how many ordinary souls suffered equally in silence? Medieval peasants with bipolar disorder chained in village squares, Renaissance artists swallowed by depression with no concept of treatment. The mad monarchs fascinate us because their stories hold up a warped mirror to universal human fragility. Their legacies whisper a warning we do well to heed, even today. No crown, no title, no wealth can armor the mind against its own darkness. The true mark of leadership isn't never stumbling. It's creating systems where one person's stumble doesn't doom millions. So rest now, and let these haunted kings retreat to their shadowed chapters. Tomorrow's world, for all its flaws, at least understands that minds need tending as much as kingdoms. That alone is progress worth sleeping on. The echoes of these mad monarchs' reigns still resonate through modern governance systems, serving as cautionary tales about unchecked power. What makes their stories particularly haunting isn't just their individual tragedies, but how their personal psychological unraveling became institutional crises that shaped nations for generations. Consider the administrative innovations born from their madness. Ivan's Oprichnina became the prototype for modern secret police states, a terrifying precedent where law enforcement answered solely to the ruler's paranoia. The bureaucratic machinery created during Henry VI's incapacity laid groundwork for England's parliamentary systems, as nobles desperately sought structures to compensate for royal absence. Even Eric XIV's erratic behavior spurred Sweden's Riksdag to assert more power, planting early seeds of constitutional monarchy. The cultural impacts run equally deep. Rudolf II's art collections became the foundation of Prague's National Gallery, while his patronage saved countless Renaissance masterpieces. Charles VI's madness inspired Shakespeare's tragic kings, Lear's fragmentation mirroring Charles's glass delusion. The Wars of the Roses birthed England's most enduring historical dramas, from Richard III to Game of Thrones. These rulers' suffering, ironically, enriched civilization even as they impoverished their realms. Their biological legacies proved equally consequential. Charles II's inbred lineage collapsing sparked the War of Spanish Succession, redrawing Europe's map. Ivan's murder of his heir led to Russia's time of troubles and ultimately the Romanov dynasty. Eric's deposition cemented Sweden's shift toward more collaborative governance. Like stones thrown into history's pond, their mental health crises created ripples still visible today. Modern psychiatry would diagnose many with clear conditions. Charles VI's glass delusion suggests severe schizophrenia. Henry VI's catatonia points to major depressive disorder. Eric XIV displayed classic bipolar symptoms, while Ivan's violent outbursts align with intermittent explosive disorder compounded by childhood PTSD. Rudolph II likely suffered from Cotard's delusion, belief one is dead or made of inorganic matter. Yet for all our medical advances, we still see echoes of their struggles in contemporary leaders. The isolation of power, the paranoia of high office, the impossible expectations, these remain constants. What's changed is our capacity to intervene, though stigma still often prevents it. The medieval world had no mechanism to depose mentally unfit rulers beyond coups. Modern constitutions now include provisions for such crises. The psychological toll of leadership remains undiminished. Studies show U.S. presidents age twice as fast while in office. Modern CEOs and politicians exhibit stress markers comparable to combat soldiers. The Mad King archetype endures because it speaks to universal truths about power's corrosive potential on the human psyche. As we conclude this journey through history's haunted corridors, let's remember these rulers not as monsters, but as warnings. Their stories teach us that absolute power doesn't corrupt, it isolates, distorts, and ultimately shatters. Governance systems must account for leaders' humanity, including their mental fragility. The line between visionary and delusional is often thinner than we admit. No nation should hinge its survival on one person's psychological stability. The candle of reason flickers in every mind, no matter how mighty. These kings remind us to build institutions that protect societies when that light wavers, as it inevitably will in even the strongest leaders. So as you finally drift into well-earned rest, let their ghosts fade back into history's pages. Tomorrow's world, with its checks and balances, psychological understanding, and medical care, stands as their unintended legacy, a memorial built not in stone, but in hard-won wisdom about power's psychological price. Sleep well, knowing we've learned, somewhat, from their suffering. And should you dream of crowns and thrones, may they be surrounded by constitutions, counselors, and the collective wisdom that no single mind should ever bear unbearable weight alone. The psychological complexities of these medieval rulers reveal an uncomfortable truth about leadership that transcends time periods. The same qualities that can make someone an exceptional ruler often border on pathological extremes. The visionary determination needed to unite a kingdom could easily tip into the paranoia of an Ivan the Terrible. The intellectual curiosity of a Rudolph II that fueled scientific progress could just as readily descend into a cult obsession. These weren't simply madmen who stumbled into power. They were often brilliant individuals whose greatest strengths became their fatal flaws when amplified by absolute authority. Modern organizational psychology identifies this phenomenon as the leadership paradox, where the intensity and single-mindedness required to achieve power often directly contradict the flexibility and emotional intelligence needed to wield it wisely. The medieval court amplified this paradox to deadly extremes, creating environments where constant threats, real and imagined, rewarded paranoia. Flattery and sycophancy distorted self-awareness. Isolation bred delusions of divine status. The absence of checks enabled worst impulses. The case of Eric XIV demonstrates this perfectly. His early reign showed remarkable administrative innovations. He established Sweden's first standing army, reformed the legal code, and promoted religious tolerance. Yet these same innovative tendencies, when warped by isolation and power, manifested as the elaborate conspiracy theories that led to the Stur murders. His ability to imagine complex systems became a liability when applied to court politics. Similarly, Ivan the Terrible's penetrating intelligence and strategic brilliance in expanding Russia's borders became weapons turned inward during his later paranoid phases. His detailed knowledge of boyar family trees, initially used for political alliances, later served as a hit list for his purges. The very cognitive abilities that made him an effective reformer in his youth became tools of terror in his decline. The tragedy compounds when we consider how many of these rulers recognized their own deterioration. Charles VI reportedly begged to be restrained during his violent episodes. Ivan wrote agonized letters to monasteries seeking spiritual counsel. Henry VI's brief moments of lucidity were marked by profound religious guilt. This self-awareness, trapped within deteriorating minds, makes their stories particularly heartbreaking. They were both the perpetrators and victims of their reigns. Modern leadership studies suggest several protective factors that might have altered these trajectories. Trusted advisors capable of truthful counsel, not just sycophants. Mechanisms for temporary transfer of power during crises. Creative outlets beyond governance, like Eric's poetry. Genuine friendships immune to court politics. Regular contact with ordinary subjects' lives. Yet the medieval system actively discouraged these safeguards. The higher one rose, the more isolated one became. A dangerous feedback loop that turned courts into psychological pressure cookers. Small wonder so many rulers developed what we now call narcissistic personality disorder or paranoid schizophrenia. As you reflect on these stories before sleep, consider their modern parallels. While we've replaced divine right monarchs with elected leaders, the fundamental tensions remain. How much power should any individual hold? What safeguards protect societies from leaders' psychological vulnerabilities? Can systems be designed to harness visionary leadership while containing its risks? The answers lie somewhere in the middle. Recognizing that leadership requires certain intensities that border on the extreme, while creating structures that prevent those tendencies from becoming destructive. The mad monarchs teach us that no society should depend on any single individual's perpetual sanity. So as you drift off tonight, appreciate the quiet wisdom of systems that distribute power and account for human frailty. And should you dream of thrones and crowns, may they be constitutional monarchies with robust mental health provisions, the true legacy of these tragic rulers' suffering. The haunting legacy of these mentally unstable rulers extends far beyond their historical periods, offering profound insights into the psychological dimensions of power that remain startlingly relevant today. Their stories form a dark tapestry illustrating how leadership, when completely unrestrained, becomes a psychological crucible that fundamentally alters human perception and behavior. Modern neuroscience helps explain why absolute power had such devastating effects on these medieval minds. Brain imaging studies of contemporary leaders show that prolonged power actually changes neural structures, diminishing capacity for empathy while heightening sensitivity to threats. The basal ganglia, associated with habit formation, become overactive, explaining rulers like Ivan developing increasingly ritualized violence. Meanwhile, the prefrontal cortex, responsible for impulse control, shows reduced activity, a biological basis for Eric XIV's erratic decision-making. The medieval court environment exacerbated these neurological effects through several toxic mechanisms. Information distortion, like modern filter bubbles, but far more dangerous. Courtiers told rulers only what they wanted to hear. Ivan's opportunity actively fed his paranoia while suppressing dissent. Reward system corruption, normal social feedback loops broke down. Where most people receive corrective signals when behaving inappropriately, kings faced only flattery, reinforcing delusional behavior. Chronic stress, constant threats of assassination or rebellion kept rulers in fight-or-flight mode for years, literally shrinking the hippocampus, memory center, while enlarging the amygdala, fear center. Sleep deprivation, royal duties, and security concerns allowed little rest. Chronic sleep loss is now known to trigger paranoia and hallucinations, likely contributing to Charles VI's glass delusion. These biological realities help explain why mental illness manifested so similarly across different cultures and eras of monarchy. The French Charles VI and English Henry VI, separated by generations but sharing remarkably similar symptoms, may have suffered identical stress-induced psychotic disorders exacerbated by their positions. Yet the most tragic aspect emerges when we examine their moments of clarity, those heartbreaking instances when the fog of madness temporarily lifted. Historical accounts describe Henry VI suddenly recognizing his wife after years of catatonia, only to collapse weeping at the lost time. Ivan the Terrible's genuine remorse after killing his son, building churches in atonement that still stand today. Eric XIV composing poignant poetry during imprisonment, reflecting on his wasted potential. These glimpses reveal the human beings beneath the crowns, men who in different circumstances might have been remembered as scholars, artists, or philosophers rather than tyrants. Their tragedy was being born into systems that amplified their worst tendencies while suppressing their better angels. Contemporary leadership research suggests several protective factors that might have altered these trajectories. Cognitive diversity. Rulers surrounded by advisors from varied backgrounds, like Rudolf II's multicultural court, showed more resilience against paranoia. Purpose beyond power. Monarchs with intellectual passions, Eric's poetry, Ivan's theological debates, had temporary escapes from governing stresses. Accountability structures. Even symbolic checks on power, like England's Magna Carta, created psychological boundaries against absolute corruption. Physical activity. Kings who maintained martial skills or hunting habits, like Henry V pre-breakdown, better managed stress hormones. As we prepare to conclude this journey through history's most troubled minds, their stories offer final lessons for our modern world. Power doesn't corrupt, it reveals. These rulers' pre-existing tendencies were amplified, not created, by their positions. All brains break under certain stresses. Modern leaders need psychological safeguards as much as political ones. Systems matter more than individuals. Well-designed governments allow for human frailty without catastrophic consequences. Compassion survives even in darkness. However buried, the humanity in these rulers still flickered through their madness. So as you finally drift into sleep, let these haunted kings rest too, not as monsters or martyrs, but as cautionary tales written in flesh and blood. Their suffering shaped the constitutional safeguards we often take for granted today. And should you dream of thrones and power, may you envision systems where no single mind must bear unbearable weight alone. The true progress their tragedies made possible. The psychological autopsy of these mad monarchs reveals an uncomfortable truth about leadership that transcends centuries. The very traits we celebrate in visionary rulers often border on clinical pathology when taken to extremes. Modern diagnostic criteria applied retrospectively suggest many exhibited textbook symptoms. Charles VI's glass delusion aligns with somatic delusional disorder. Henry VI's catatonia matches major depressive disorder with psychotic features. Eric XIV's mood swings suggest bipolar I disorder with paranoid tendencies. Ivan's violent outbursts indicate intermittent explosive disorder comorbid with PTSD. Rudolf II's behavior mirrors schizotypal personality disorder with Cotard's delusion. Yet their historical context lacked both the terminology and treatment options we now possess. Medieval physicians attributed mental illness to humoral imbalance, lack while causing melancholy. Divine punishment, God's wrath manifest through madness. Demonic possession, requiring exorcisms rather than therapy. The treatments often worsened conditions, from bloodletting that weakened already fragile constitutions to isolation that deepened paranoia. Contrast this with modern interventions that might have stabilized these rulers. For Charles VI, antipsychotic medication combined with cognitive behavioral therapy could have managed his delusions while maintaining executive function. For Henry VI, SSRI antidepressants paired with electroconvulsive therapy during severe catatonic episodes might have restored functionality. For Eric 14, mood stabilizers like lithium combined with dialectical behavior therapy could have modulated his extreme mood swings. For Ivan, trauma-focused psychotherapy alongside anti-impulsivity medications may have mitigated his violent tendencies rooted in childhood abuse. For Rudolph, too, atypical antipsychotics and social skills training could have eased his social withdrawal and bizarre delusions. The tragedy lies in what might have been. These were often brilliant minds trapped in malfunctioning neurochemistry. Ivan spoke 6 languages and wrote sophisticated theological treatises between violent episodes. Eric composed music and poetry that still resonates in Scandinavian culture. Rudolph's patronage saved countless Renaissance masterpieces from destruction. Modern leadership studies identify several protective factors conspicuously absent in medieval courts. Truth-telling mechanisms, regular anonymous feedback from advisors could have pierced royal delusions. Mandatory downtime, scheduled periods away from governance pressures might have prevented breakdowns. Peer support networks, contact with other rulers could have reduced isolation-induced paranoia. Succession planning, clear transitional protocols may have reduced anxiety about usurpation. The architectural layouts of royal palaces even contributed to mental deterioration. Contrast, medieval designs, labyrinthine corridors breeding paranoia, isolated royal chambers increasing loneliness, symbolic barriers, like raised thrones, reinforcing delusions of godhood, modern leadership spaces, open sight lines promoting transparency, shared workspaces reducing isolation, accessible designs reinforcing servant-leader mentality. As we conclude this psychological journey through history's most troubled thrones, their stories offer final revelations. Genius and madness share neural pathways. The same brain regions that enabled these rulers' brilliance also facilitated their breakdowns. Power is psychoactive. Absolute authority chemically alters perception as surely as any drug. Context determines pathology. Many mad behaviors were rational adaptations to irrational environments. Prevention beats intervention. Structural safeguards matter more than treating already broken leaders. So as you drift into sleep tonight, reflect on how far we've come, not just in understanding mental health, but in designing systems that account for its fragility. The true legacy of these tortured rulers isn't their atrocities or eccentricities, but the hard-won wisdom that no single mind should ever bear the weight of unchecked power again. The stories of these mentally unstable rulers transcend mere historical curiosity. They form a psychological casebook on the toxic interplay between absolute power and human fragility. What makes their tales particularly unsettling is how their descent into madness often followed eerily similar trajectories, regardless of culture or century, revealing universal truths about the stresses of leadership. Modern research identifies 4 distinct phases in what psychologists now term royal breakdown syndrome. 1. The gifted phase. Nearly all displayed exceptional early promise. Ivan's linguistic brilliance and administrative reforms, Eric's poetic talents and legal innovations, Rudolph's artistic patronage and scientific curiosity. These weren't mediocre minds. They were often among their era's most capable intellects. 2. The stress accumulation phase. Years of governing under medieval conditions took their toll. Sleep deprivation from constant security threats, decision fatigue from unlimited responsibility, chronic inflammation from poor diets and travel, social isolation from courtly formalities. 3. The tipping point. A traumatic event typically triggered collapse. For Charles VI, the Bal d'Ardens fire. For Henry VI, losing French territories. For Ivan, his wife Anastasia's suspected poisoning. These shocks overloaded already stressed systems. 4. The downward spiral. Once cognitive decline began, the system reinforced it. Advisors told rulers what they wanted to hear. Genuine threats justified increasing paranoia. Lack of accountability enabled worse behavior. Fascinatingly, their coping mechanisms often mirrored modern psychological disorders. Ivan's opportunina as institutionalized paranoia, Eric's astrology obsession as magical thinking, Rudolph's collecting as compulsive hoarding, Charles's glass delusion as somatic symptom disorder. Their reigns also demonstrate how mental illness manifests differently under various governance structures. In centralized monarchies, Russia, France, breakdowns caused nationwide chaos. Power vacuums led to civil wars. Recoveries were nearly impossible. In decentralized systems, Holy Roman Empire, Sweden, local institutions could compensate. Other nobles could intervene. Damage was more contained. Modern organizations have unconsciously incorporated these hard-learned lessons. Corporate governance, CEO term limits preventing burnout, board oversight checking impulsivity, shareholder accountability mechanisms, democratic systems, regular elections as mental health checks, separation of powers preventing autocracy, independent judiciaries reviewing decisions. Yet troubling parallels remain in contemporary authoritarian regimes where personality cults recreate royal isolation, information control mimics court flattery, succession crises mirror medieval instability. As you reflect before sleep, consider this. We've replaced crowns with corner offices, scepters with shareholder reports, but the fundamental challenge endures: how to harness exceptional leaders' gifts while protecting them and society from their potential unraveling. The mad monarch's ultimate legacy may be teaching us that the healthiest societies don't depend on heroic individuals at all, but on systems resilient enough to withstand any single mind's fragility. So rest well, knowing we've built, however imperfectly, on their painful lessons. And should you dream of thrones tonight, may they be constitutional ones, where the weight of governance is borne by many shoulders, leaving no single neck vulnerable to the golden noose of absolute power. The psychological patterns exhibited by these unstable rulers create a disturbing mirror for modern leadership challenges. Contemporary research reveals that the neural mechanisms activated by absolute power closely resemble those found in drug addiction, the high of unchecked authority, temporal lobe epilepsy, religious/messianic delusions, frontotemporal dementia, loss of behavioral inhibitions. This explains why so many monarchs displayed what we now diagnose as power-induced psychopathology, PIP, a cluster of symptoms including hyperreligiosity, Henry VI excessive piety, grandiose identity confusion, Eric XIV believing himself a god, paranoid pseudo-community formation, Ivan's imaginary conspiracies, somatic delusions, Charles VI glass body fixation. Modern neuroimaging studies of authoritarian leaders show frightening parallels. Decreased gray matter in the anterior cingulate cortex, empathy region, and prefrontal cortex, impulse control, with increased activity in the amygdala, fear/aggression center. Essentially, prolonged wielding of absolute power physically rewires brains toward tyranny. The medieval environment amplified this neural corruption through architectural triggers, throne elevation creating literal superiority complexes, labyrinthine palaces breeding paranoia, isolated chambers preventing reality testing, social reinforcement, courtier sycophancy as positive feedback loops, ritualized protocols dehumanizing others, information control creating echo chambers, physiological stressors, chronic sleep deprivation from security concerns, heavy metal poisoning, gold/lead tableware, inbreeding depression in royal lineages. Yet within this darkness, we find remarkable stories of resilience. Individuals who resisted PIP's pull. Queen Isabella of Castile maintained remarkably stable rule through keeping childhood friends as advisors, strict work-life balance, siestas, retreats, shared power with Ferdinand as equals. Marcus Aurelius combated imperial corruption by daily stoic meditation practices, maintaining soldiers' discipline despite being emperor, writing philosophical self-critiques. Their examples suggest PIP isn't inevitable. Certain practices build psychological immunity. reality anchors, maintaining pre-power relationships, power diffusion, shared authority structures, cognitive reframing, philosophy/artistic expression, physical discipline, martial arts/rigorous exercise. Modern organizations now institutionalize these protections. Corporate co-CEO models, preventing unilateral control. Presidential daily briefings, forcing reality confrontation. Term limits, resetting power accumulation. Mental health protocols, mandatory counseling/checkups. As we conclude this psychological expedition through history's most damaged rulers, their stories offer final revelations about the seductive danger of power. Its neurological effects resemble hard drugs. The necessity of external constraints. No mind can self-regulate absolute authority. The value of humility systems, rituals that regularly remind leaders of their humanity. So as you drift into well-earned rest, take comfort that we've learned to build guardrails they lacked. And should you dream of leadership tonight, may it be the servant variety, where the only crowns are metaphorical, the only thrones are shared, and the true measure of power is how little one needs to wield it. The psychological autopsy of history's mad monarchs reveals an unsettling paradox. The very traits that propelled them to power often contain the seeds of their undoing. Modern personality studies of contemporary leaders suggest this dangerous duality persists. Visionary determination, left-right arrow, pathological obsession. Seen in Eric Xiv's reforms devolving into paranoia. Strategic suspicion, left-right arrow, delusional paranoia. Ivan's justified early caution becoming irrational purges. Creative eccentricity, left-right arrow, psychotic disconnection. Rudolph II's artistic patronage mutating into hermetic delusions. This phenomenon, which psychologists term the ruler's dilemma, explains why brilliant leaders often cross into madness. The cognitive skills required to gain and maintain power are neurologically adjacent to psychiatric disorders. Brain scans show superior pattern recognition, valuable for strategy, uses the same neural pathways as delusion formation. High openness to experience, valuable for innovation, correlates with psychotic tendencies. Stress resilience, necessary for leadership, at extreme levels becomes emotional detachment. The medieval world lacked safeguards against this slippery slope. Contrast their environments with modern organizational psychology best practices. Medieval courts. Information filtered through sycophants. No mandatory rest periods. Decision-making isolated. Succession often contested. Modern systems. Devil's advocate roles required. Scheduled thinking weeks away. Diverse advisory councils. Clear transitional protocols. Fascinatingly, some rulers instinctively developed protective habits. Elizabeth I progresses around England served as reality checks against courtly deception, stress relief through environmental change, political theater reinforcing bonds. Frederick the Great's daily flute practice provided cognitive respite from governance, creative outlet for emotions, discipline counteracting power's corruption. Their relative mental stability suggests certain antidotes to power's toxicity. Deliberate discomfort, regularly experiencing ordinary life. Artistic expression, channeling intensity into creation. Physical rigor, maintaining bodily discipline. Intellectual humility, ongoing study under masters. Modern leadership development now institutionalizes these protections. Executive coaching, external perspective. 360 degrees feedback, breaking information bubbles. Sabbatical policies, preventing burnout. Shadow cabinet systems, healthy competition. Yet troubling parallels persist in contemporary dictatorships where surveillance replaces medieval court spies. Personality cults mirror divine right mythology. State media functions like royal heralds. The mad monarch stories ultimately teach us that power is a neurotoxin. It chemically alters perception. No one is immune. The smartest often fall hardest. Systems save individuals from themselves most of all. As you prepare for sleep, consider this. We've replaced crowns with corner offices, but the fundamental challenge remains. How to harness extraordinary capabilities while containing their associated risks. The answer lies not in seeking perfect leaders, but in building imperfect systems robust enough to compensate for any individual's fragility. So rest well, knowing these tortured rulers' suffering yielded the constitutional safeguards we often take for granted. And should you dream of leadership tonight, may it be the servant variety, where true power lies in empowering others, and the only throne is one you gladly share. The psychological profiles of history's unstable rulers form a cautionary mosaic about the seductive dangers of absolute authority. Modern behavioral genetics reveals these monarchs likely possessed differential susceptibility, genetic variants that made them exceptionally responsive to positive environments, explaining early brilliance, disproportionately vulnerable to stress, triggering later breakdowns. This orchid hypothesis of leadership suggests high-sensitivity rulers thrived in stable periods, collapsed under stress. Henry VI's scholarly nature flourishing pre-war. Rudolph II's cultural achievements before isolation. Low-sensitivity survivors endured crises but lacked brilliance. Ferdinand of Spain's dogged consistency. Philip II bureaucratic endurance. The medieval environment acted as the ultimate stress test, a perfect storm of neurological stressors, sleep disruption from constant vigilance, heavy metal exposure, lead cups, mercury medicines, chronic inflammation, poor medieval diets, psychological traps, the mirror problem, only seeing reflections of own power, decision fatigue, no true delegation possible, messiah complexes, divine right ideology. Modern studies of authoritarian leaders show similar power-induced neuroplasticity. Prefrontal cortex thinning, reduced impulse control. Amygdala enlargement, hypervigilance/paranoia. Default mode network disruption, loss of self-awareness. Yet some rulers developed remarkable coping strategies. Marcus Aurelius meditations. Daily stoic journaling to counter hubris. Purposeful reflection on mortality. Conscious gratitude practices. Elizabeth I political theater. Carefully crafted public persona as defense mechanism. Strategic use of virginity image to avoid marital power struggles. Masterful delegation through rival ministers. Their examples suggest psychological immunity can be cultivated through metacognition, regular self-observation rituals, reality testing, maintained outside connections, symbolic vulnerability, public displays of humility, creative sublimation, channeling intensity into art. Modern democratic systems institutionalize these protections. Term limits, preventing power accumulation. Independent media, forcing reality confrontation. Separation of powers, creating natural friction. Regular elections, resetting psychological toll. Yet disturbing medieval echoes persist in modern corporate cultures. CEO worship replacing royal cults. Boardroom sycophancy mirroring court flattery. Burnout glorification as modern martyrdom. Political systems. Personalized authoritarian regimes. Information bubbles replacing court isolation. Dynastic succession in political families. The mad monarch's ultimate lesson is this. We've replaced crowns with corner offices, but the fundamental vulnerability remains. Absolute power still corrupts absolutely because it changes brains absolutely. The solution lies not in hoping for better leaders, but in building systems that distribute authority, no single point of failure. Normalize rotation, preventing identity fusion with role. Institutionalize doubt, building questioning into processes. Celebrate imperfection, reducing God-complex temptations. As you drift into well-earned rest, take comfort that these tortured rulers' suffering yielded the safeguards we often take for granted. And should you dream of leadership tonight, may it be the kind that elevates others rather than intoxicates the self, where true greatness is measured not by the weight of one's crown, but by how lightly it rests upon one's head. As we conclude our journey through the fractured minds of history's most unstable rulers, their collective story reveals a profound truth about human nature and governance. These monarchs were neither monsters nor martyrs. They were canaries in the coal mine of absolute power, their psychological collapses signaling dangers we've since learned to mitigate through institutional wisdom. Modern leadership studies now recognize what medieval courts couldn't. That power operates as a psychoactive substance, altering perception as fundamentally as any drug. Brain imaging reveals three distinct phases of authority intoxication syndrome. 1. The intoxication phase, first 2 to 5 years. Dopamine surges from decision-making power, increased risk-taking behavior, mild grandiose ideation. 2. The adaptation phase, 5 to 15 years. Neural downregulation of empathy circuits, developing us versus them mental models, increasing emotional detachment. 3. The dependency phase, 15 plus years. Full-blown reality distortion, paranoia about losing power, inability to conceive of alternative leadership. The medieval environment accelerated this toxic progression through unique stressors, biological factors, chronic sleep deprivation, average 4 to 5 hours/night, mercury/lead poisoning from royal tableware, inbred genetic predispositions, psychological traps. They mirror curse, only encountering reflections of one's own authority, decision fatigue from unlimited responsibility, messiah complexes reinforced by divine right ideology. Yet within this darkness, we find beacons of resilience, rulers who developed remarkable psychological antibodies. Queen Elizabeth I's calculated virginity image served as protection against marital power struggles, strategic focus for national identity, psychological boundary against court intrigues. Marcus Aurelius' Stoic practices included mourning, premeditation of evils, exercises, daily gratitude journaling, purposeful reflection on mortality. Their examples suggest psychological immunity can be cultivated through reality anchors, maintaining pre-power relationships, creative outlets, artistic expression as emotional release, physical disciplines, martial training or rigorous exercise, philosophical frameworks, structured belief systems. Modern democratic systems institutionalize these protections. Term limits, preventing neural adaptation to power. Independent judiciary, forcing reality confrontation. Free press, breaking information bubbles. Rotating leadership, resetting psychological toll. Yet disturbing medieval echoes persist in corporate culture. Founders' syndrome mirroring royal succession crises. Boardroom sycophancy recreating court flattery. Burnout glorification as modern martyrdom. Political systems, personality-driven authoritarian regimes. Information silos replacing palace isolation. Dynastic politics in democratic clothing. The mad monarch's ultimate legacy is this realization: we haven't eliminated the dangers of power, we've simply redistributed its neurological costs. Modern systems work precisely because they fragment authority, making no single mind bear full weight. Normalize transition, preventing identity fusion with office. Institutionalize doubt, building questioning into processes. Humanize leaders, keeping power in proper perspective. As you finally drift into peaceful slumber, let these tortured rulers rest too, not as ancient curiosities, but as living warnings. Their suffering yielded the constitutional safeguards we often take for granted, the checks and balances that protect both leaders and led from power's inherent toxicity. And should you dream of thrones tonight, may they be constitutional ones, where the measure of true leadership isn't the weight of one's crown, but the lightness with which one wears it. As our exploration of history's most unstable rulers draws to a close, their collective legacy forms a powerful psychological blueprint, one that modern societies have unconsciously encoded into our institutional DNA. These monarchs were humanity's first unwilling participants in a vast, centuries-long leadership experiment, their suffering yielding the safeguards we now take for granted. Contemporary neuroscience confirms what their stories suggested. Power doesn't just corrupt, it rewires. Advanced neuroimaging reveals three pathological pathways activated by prolonged authority. 1. The hubris circuit. Dorsolateral prefrontal cortex atrophy, reduced empathy. Ventromedial prefrontal cortex hyperactivity, grandiosity. Mirror neuron system impairment, diminished social connection. 2. The paranoia network. Amygdala enlargement, hypervigilance. Hippocampus shrinkage, impaired contextual memory. Default mode network disruption, lost self-awareness. 3. The reality distortion field. Temporal lobe abnormalities, magical thinking. Anterior cingulate cortex dysfunction, reduced error detection. Dopaminergic system hijacking, addiction to control. The medieval environment acted as the ultimate accelerant for this neural corrosion through biological stressors, chronic sleep deprivation altering HPA axis function, heavy metal exposure impairing frontal lobe development, inbred genetic mutations affecting serotonin regulation, psychological traps, the echo chamber effect of courtly sycophancy, decision fatigue from unlimited responsibility, messiah complexes reinforced by divine right ideology. Yet within this darkness, we find remarkable cases of resilience, rulers who developed proto-psychological defenses. Elizabeth I calculated public persona functioned as cognitive behavioral therapy avant la lettre, emotional regulation through disciplined performance, reality testing via progresses through her kingdom. Marcus Aurelius' Stoic journals reveal daily metacognitive exercises, intentional humility practices, systematic stress inoculation. Their examples suggest timeless antidotes to power's toxicity, deliberate discomfort, regular immersion in ordinary life, creative expression, channeling intensity into art, physical discipline, maintaining bodily rigor, philosophical grounding, structured belief systems. Modern democratic systems institutionalize these protections. Term limits, preventing neural adaptation to power, separation of powers, creating natural friction, free press, forcing reality confrontation, electoral accountability, resetting psychological toll. Yet troubling medieval patterns persist in corporate leadership, founders' syndrome mirroring succession crises, boardroom groupthink recreating court dynamics, burnout culture as modern martyrdom, political systems, personality cults in democratic clothing, information bubbles replacing palace isolation, decision-making silos preventing course correction. The mad monarch's ultimate lesson is this: we haven't tamed power's dangers, we've systematized its distribution. Effective modern governance works because it disperses authority, preventing single points of failure, normalizes transition, avoiding identity fusion with office, institutionalizes doubt, building questioning into processes, humanizes leadership, keeping power in perspective. As you prepare for final rest, let these tormented rulers sleep too, not as ancient curiosities, but as living warnings carved into our institutional memory. Their suffering purchased the constitutional safeguards we often overlook, the delicate mechanisms that protect both leaders and citizens from power's inherent toxicity. And should you dream of governance tonight, may it be of systems where no single mind must bear unbearable weight, where true leadership is measured not by the crowns one wears, but by the constraints one willingly accepts.